Hello, welcome back to the GM's Guide. I'm your host, Dan Felder, your kind and merciful GM, and today we are going to be continuing our discussion of Ravenshadow. So, if this is your first time turning into this podcast, like always, I highly recommend you, probably start from the beginning, but also, at the very least, jump back to episode 22, I think it is at least, which is Michael Bay D&D, which everyone has called Michael Bay D&D, because that's where this whole process started. I am going through the creation process from the first concept to the very final adventure notes of my favorite campaign ever, using my original time-stamped notes of the process and showing how I put the whole thing together. Now, when we last left off, we were talking about, we had just built the 4 character creation arcs, and we were going through the idea pool process, which is how I build a lot of these. It's how I create things in general. It's everything. I use it for my game design, I use it for my adventure design, narrative design, and that whole process is massively useful. And now it's time to start having all the ideas hit the table, so to speak. For this episode, we're going to go through the creation of the major antagonists for my campaign and how they added more variety to my individual character journeys, and most importantly, we're going to go through how we actually structure the 6-episode campaign through a multiplot that will allow all 4 of our players' stories to shine, rather than the standard plot process, which would simply not work for what we have in mind. It's very, very cool stuff. At least I think it's cool. And hopefully you do too, because you're listening to this incredibly practical, story theory podcast. Now, before we get into that, though, I want to tell a cool story that happened over the course of vacation. When I released my episode on Chad's character, Cyrus, I had spent a whole episode delving through the issues that character posed for the purpose of the campaign. The biggest one, and the one that got the most focus, was that Chad as a player loves dark magic. He loves being the cool, using evil for good character. That's what he really, really enjoys. He loves the anti-hero. Dexter, Alucard, these are the types of characters he really loves portraying. And I made a big deal about that. And I said that my ultimate goal for the campaign was that I was going to have to convince him to go on a growth arc. Not just his character, the player would have to change his attitudes over the course of the campaign, at least for this adventure. And the reason was because if I wanted Chad to love his ending, and if his character ultimately turned to the light or did something that made sense in the story, then he wasn't going to necessarily enjoy that unless he had decided to change his attitudes as well. And his attitudes, as he mentioned explicitly in his goals for the character, was that his character was going to learn that having dark magical powers wasn't such a bad thing after all. That that's not really what made him a bad person. He was a good person who could use darkness for good. This is frankly a compelling moral and a very interesting idea, except it makes no sense in this theme. It's like a guy turning up to a Lord of the Rings RPG story and saying, okay, my character, I really would love if he was the one guy who could use the One Ring efficiently, and he ultimately learns that the One Ring isn't actually bad, Sauron's just misunderstood, and that evil powers can be used for good. And that's where I want him to end up. This undermines the entire story of the One Ring, and it ruins the campaign. It shatters its thematic weight. The One Ring represents temptation and darkness, and that's what dark powers are in this setting as well. You can't make a bargain with darkness. It never, ever works. Chad's had to change his attitudes over the course of the campaign, or he would not be able to enjoy the campaign. And I set out to make sure that he, the player, would change his attitudes over the course of the campaign. So, I released this episode, and Chad listens to it. And this is very new, because I never tell my players what I'm planning or what I'm thinking during the creation process. I want the adventures to feel as real and deliberate as possible, not just an extension of my own twisted motivations. And so, I don't tell players what's behind the locked door. Also because then they lose their curiosity to open the locked door. If they want to know what's behind this door, or what this character's secret might be, or what would have happened if they had done this, but it's risky, well, they can just ask me after the game otherwise and say, hey, what would have happened if we'd done this? What was behind this door? And a lot of dungeon masters will tell them. And they'll say, oh, it was this really cool thing. And so they don't have to investigate anymore. Now, I want my characters to feel curious and motivated. I want my players to feel like they have to take actions in-game to find out what's going on and to know what's happening. So I don't tell them these things. So, with Ravenshadow, my players are actually getting to listen to what's going on behind the scenes for once. And Chad, right after the episode aired, contacted me and said, all right, Daniel, we need to talk. We need to talk. Not usually a good sign. So we met up, because I was actually on vacation back in America, which was fantastic. And we met up and we did some gaming, we did some game design, talked about RPGs and stuff. And he said, okay, listen, I don't think you understand what a big impact you actually had in this campaign. Because you kept saying, Chad always loves playing dark characters. That's what he does. And I was, well, guess what, Dan? I don't do that anymore. Ever since Ravenshadow, I play paladins. That's what I play. When I'm not dungeon mastering, I am playing a paladin 90% of the time. I was like, what? Because the Chad was originated the whole thing about lawful stupid paladins and how that's not at all what he likes to do. He loves playing the dark character every single time. And he's saying, no, I play paladins now. That's what I do. Ever since Ravenshadow, that's what I do. And that just blew my mind. I was like, whoa. And he's saying, yeah, I didn't fully realize until I listened to the podcast, but yes, this is where the turning point came. And I tried to go back to doing dark characters for a while. It did not really do anything. It didn't really work for me anymore. And I just ended up playing paladins ever since my character became one in Ravenshadow. That's what I do. Now, this is really cool for obvious reasons, but one thing I really want to emphasize is that this stuff really, really works. When you have good players and you use practical design, you follow this theory, the stuff that I'm talking about, which of course, is just stuff I've picked up often from experimentation, psychological studies, lots of great theory written by other giants who I'm standing on the shoulders of, you can accomplish amazing things. And you can change somebody's whole outlook on gaming for years to come. And that's an amazing thing to be a part of. And it's a great thing to have those types of players who are willing to open up at your table. So thanks, Chad, for telling me that. That's fantastic. But now it's time to get back to the meat of this episode. And also, if you've been hearing a few quacks in the background or just general mayhem, that is because I am not in my standard recording space. I am out in the park talking weirdly into my phone, recording this podcast in the open because it's a fantastic day outside and there's lots of crazy people around. So a guy talking wildly into a phone about RPGs is not something that's going to raise a lot of eyebrows. This is just a great park too. There's tons of ridiculously awesome, weird birds and animals and stuff. So it's fun to do. So sorry if you're getting a lot of background noise, but hopefully my sheer enthusiasm will kick things up. Okay, so for the rest of the episode, let's lay into the major pieces of story structure and character focus that we need to hit. The major challenge of Ravenshadow at this point was that I had to do an episode structure I was completely unfamiliar with. And I'm going to walk you through how I solved these new problems. So the first thing was, I was not doing a standard arc plot with a major character getting a subplot focus. Now, the way that most RPGs work is you've got a main plot that everybody's got a big crisis that they need to solve. Like, here's the monster of the week, or here's the monster of the campaign, and the monster really determines what's happening in the story, and the heroes respond to it. Really, in a lot of these stories, the villain is the protagonist, but it's a tragic story that we just happen to be viewing from the perspective of the heroes. I want to emphasize that. Most major heroic stories in this genre are often not about the heroes, they're about the villains. The heroes are often just sort of doing a job, and they don't change over the course of the campaign or the adventure. James Bond doesn't usually grow as a person over the course of most James Bond stories. Most superhero action movies, summer blockbusters, these characters often do not change substantially from the beginning of the story to the end of it. But the movies can often be incredible despite that. And that's because the stories aren't really about the heroes. The stories are mostly about the villains. They are tragedies where the villains ultimately are brought low by their ambition or a tragic flaw, which ambition can be, classic hubris in Greek mythology, any number of these things. We just happen to be viewing it through the lens of a hero. The Greek tragedy never really died. We just all think of them as action movies now, and the great ones are focused on the failings of the villain, but they're shown through the lens of the hero. This is why, if you've ever wondered, people often say like a villain is the most important part of the story. That's because they're talking about this type of tragic story structure. Very often, a villain is not the most important part of a heroic story. Often the hero is the most important part of the heroic story, because the story is actually about the hero. But in a lot of these stories, it's actually about the villain. And that's very convenient, because when you have a group of like 4 or 5 people who are all trying to work together, and you want to put emphasis on that team, in an RPG especially, it's very difficult to have 4 or 5 simultaneous stories. It's much easier to say, hey, here's the villain, he's a fascinating villain, she's a fascinating villain, here's all the stuff he or she is doing, here's all the stuff that's going on, and make you really interested in who the villain is. And now you hero guys, just do your jobs. Do your dang jobs. Now that is a good thing that works well, but it's not what's going on in Ravenshadow. In Ravenshadow, every individual player has their own growth arc, and we need to figure out a way to weave those together over just 6 episodes. Just 6 episodes. 4 stories, 6 episodes, all have to be woven together in a workable scene structure. How are we going to do that? Well, as you should know by now, the first thing I want to do is look at what other series or other media have handled similar channels and what they did. This provides usually great ideas and great things to avoid, great things that didn't work. You want to work off someone's existing blueprint and figure out what parts were good ideas, what parts were bad ideas, and give you something to start with. Take some of that white space off the page. So what other types of mediums have to deal with multiple different stories happening all at once? Well, there's a whole plot structure that is called this. It's known as MultiPlot. MultiPlot structures tend to follow multiple different characters, often in multiple interweaving storylines. This is very common in books, and it's very common in TV series. And the reason is simple. It's an incredibly efficient way to keep people from changing the channel or from putting a book down. Many TV shows last between half an hour and an hour for just a given episode, and for a whole season, it's way longer. And they don't want you to ever leave in the middle of an episode, because then you're less likely to watch the next episode, and they're desperate to get you to tune in as a viewing habit week in and week out. And now with the interesting elements of Netflix and such, that's getting a little disrupted, but still, individual creators want you, if you're binge watching them, to also stick with the series the whole way through. And the point is, books and TV shows are both very easy to put down, unlike a movie where you're belted into your seat, it feels like, for the 2 hours, but also they are much longer form experiences. A movie, you're often not even in there for a full 2 hours, hour and a half. Whereas with a book, you can often go up to 40 hours in the case of things like epic fantasy novels especially. But 40 hours, 40! That's a really long time. How do you keep people invested for that long? And a TV season is often a good portion of that, and multiple seasons can go for way longer than that. So how do you keep people invested? How do you make sure that people are never getting bored, they never just check out and turn out, also known as churn out in the design industries? How do you keep people from churning, which means that they stop engaging with your product and they never open it again, never watch it again? It's very, very, very hard. But one technique that is very easy to execute and has a huge impact here is the multiplot structure. Let's say we open a book or a TV show like this, and it works fine for both of them. You start with a charming scene with a couple on their honeymoon, and they're going off on their honeymoon, you're getting to know the characters, the writers are making it very snappy and charming and engaging in the short term, and then suddenly there's a kidnapping. And terrorists take over the hotel, they start holding everybody hostage, and then as the chapter ends, let's talk about this in book terminology for a moment, the honeymooning couple are put with bags over their heads and they're hoarded into a truck with guns at their backs. And so then we go to the next chapter. We want to find out, okay, we've gotten to like these characters, we care about them, what's going to happen? We turn the page, next chapter, and what happens? We're with some guy who's making coffee in the morning, and he's thinking about his job, and he's thinking about his daughter, and it's a totally different guy, and he's on his way to work. And we're like, well, what? I'm not interested in this. I care about this other couple. I need to keep reading to find out what happens to them. But the thing is, That's why you're reading this now. So what happens is you get to know this guy and you find out, oh, he's a retired police sergeant who was an expert in counterterrorism. And so what happens is suddenly he gets a call to come into work, and his old bosses, who he's got a problem with, tell him that they need him on this investigation because this old guy he was chasing and that he thought was dead, turns out is actually behind this particular heist. And so they need to get him as expert as a counsel. He's not getting his job back. He's not getting any sort of consideration, but they want him to help with this investigation uncredited. And why? Because they know that he'll do it because he cares about the situation. And his new boss is a jerk who wants all the credit for himself. So now we're starting to care about this guy. We're starting to wonder, will he stick it to his old boss? And you're kind of wondering what's going on with that. We like this underdog. Who's really good at his job, and he's in a tough situation, and now he's one of our major ways to help the people we care about. So now we're caring about this guy too. And then, right then, a bomb explodes in the police building in the middle of this meeting, right as the guy's about to accept the offer. And he sees the bomb just a fraction of a second before it goes off. He realizes what's going on, and he dives forward to shield his corrupt former boss from the blast out of sheer instinct. And so we see the explosion happen, we see him start to happen, or it's about to happen, and he leaps forward, and we turn the page to find out what's going to happen next. What's going to happen next? And where are we? We're back with the hooded couple in the truck being driven away. So you see, by this point, we kept reading because we were always concerned about the couple. We always wanted to know what was going to happen with them. But now we're wondering what's going to happen with this police guy. What's going to happen with him? And so now we're reading with the story of the couple. We're also going to keep reading even through any potential boring point because we want to get back to our original police guy. And if you really want to stretch things, you can do 3 storylines. The Codex Alera, my favorite fantasy series, I've got to do a whole podcast just breaking down how brilliant the world building is and how excellent a lot of the characters are and why they work so well. But seriously, amazing. I need to run a campaign inspired by this at some point. Well, the Codex Alera, in the later books, always has 3 plot lines, and it's even sort of present in the earlier ones too, but he really locks it down in the middle books of the series, in which you've got an intrigue plot line with some of the characters, you've got a war plot line with some of the characters, and you've got a diplomacy plot line with some of the characters. Now, all 3 of these storylines interlace, and they all end on cliffhangers whenever you're pursuing them. And so you're always kept engaged through a 30, 40-hour experience, and you never want to put the book down for the most part. I mean, there's always some lull in something that long, but for the most part, you are just hooked and you're pulled along through these massive books, and they're just fantastic. So, by the way, that's 30, 40 hours on audiobook. And usually, they're not all that long as well, so don't feel like terribly intimidated. You've probably read books that are longer than them. I've just been re-listening to them on audio recently, and so I see exactly how many hours they take when you have to slowly read every word out loud. So, this is how MultiPlot works, and if you do it correctly, you always end each different plot piece on a cliffhanger, and you always keep the reader engaged. This is a great model, but we can't literally translate it to RPGs. Now, if you're producing a web show where people watch you play an RPG, this is a great structure because you can focus on 1 or 2 characters at a time, and then the audience will be engaged in whatever is happening right now in another storyline because they're still curious about what's going to happen in that other storyline. However, in an RPG, people are kind of there for the whole gaming night. They're not going to suddenly up and leave halfway through a session usually, so you're not really worried about that particular problem. And in terms of players just churning out. And on the other hand, people will be more engaged in their own story. They will be more engaged in what they are doing than watching what somebody else is doing. So instead of increasing motivation, you're really limiting motivation. However, we can capture the essence of why this works through a technique called spotlighting or special relevance. Now it's time to talk about a slightly different technique called multi-protagonists to explain what I mean by spotlighting and special relevance. Now, multi-plots are different than multi-protagonists, even though they sound like they should go together. A multi-plot is when there are multiple different plots in the same story. A multi-protagonist is when there is one story that has multiple protagonists. Now, there are many examples of this, but ultimately multi-protagonists are built when multiple different characters are all working together and have the same goals. They might have different reasons for those goals, but ultimately they succeed and fail together. Something that affects one of them affects the rest of them. And a lot of good TV shows and good fantasy epics are built along this construct. And frankly, almost all RPGs are built as multi-protagonists. You've got a group of different characters who all basically function as a hive mind trying to accomplish the same goals. That's very standard in a classical RPG adventure. Now, spotlighting is a way to take a multi-protagonist and give one of those characters special focus to move their story along. This is done in a lot of different ways, but mostly it's done by making the crisis or the monster of the week or whatever you're dealing with especially relevant to one of your protagonists in your big multi-protagonist bundle. Leverage has great examples of this. For example, in Leverage, you've got a group of characters that really operate like a D&D party. They've got their fighter, they've got their thief, they've got their wizard. He's a hacker, it's modern day, but he functions like a wizard for all intents and purposes. They've got their bard, and they've got really their dungeon master. And every episode, they work together to take down a new corrupt CEO or a new government official. Now, how do you do that for 5 seasons and still get focused on your individual characters? Well, they do it via special relevance. For example, let's say that they're dealing with a corrupt orphanage. Well, one of their characters grew up in a bad foster system and was an orphan. So, for her, this villain has special relevance. It digs up trash in her past. It causes her to talk about her problems. It has big emotional stakes for her that can make her make mistakes that she otherwise wouldn't normally make. It can complicate the team because they might have to save more than just the kid they came in to save, because this time it's personal, that sort of thing. Another episode, they're going up against a pharmaceutical company, an insurance company that let one of the major characters' kid die rather than pay his medical bills after years of him helping them and working for them. Obviously, this guy wants to take him down specifically. It's personal. This villain has special relevance to him. When they go to an alcoholic, they go after an alcoholic, they get him into rehab, and they have to check themselves into rehab in order to keep an eye on him. And this has very big relevance for the member of the team that is an alcoholic. Suddenly he's confronting issues of sobriety and issues of his own alcoholic dependence. This is huge. So you see what happens is they take an episode, and sometimes it'll just be a general episode. It'll just be fun. Sometimes it has special relevance to one of the characters. And even though everybody in the team is engaged with this villain, and they all want to take this villain down because the villain's a jerk, well, it's extra meaningful to one of our characters, and they get that special focus, that spotlight, that special relevance. This suits my goals perfectly. I want everyone engaged, but I want one of the players to be getting focused so I can move their story along. So I decided that I would start building villains and antagonists that had special relevance to one of my character's stories and can move their story along at any given time. Meanwhile, the rest of the group would still care about it because an antagonist is trying to stop all of them, which will of course mess with all their goals. Everybody cares about their survival. If you're killed here, you won't be able to pursue your story when it is time for you to work again. And also people will just hate villains if they're presented as evil and disliked. It might not be relevant to your story in particular, but you'll still be motivated to solve that problem, and you'll still be motivated to help your friend. This was my tool to keep everybody engaged while moving between the different elements of every person's individual plot. That's right, you get a personalized villain, you get a personalized villain, everybody gets personalized villains. Now, some of our characters already had good ones laid out. We already had some individual stuff we've talked about before about characters that would have personalized villains. Now, the Shade, the personification of the dark spirits of the Isle, ends up fitting as the perfect foil for Cyrus, because he's particularly interested in Cyrus, and he's trying to corrupt him. He's trying to get him to turn to darkness, and he's got a long personal history with Cyrus's bloodline in Sir Brecton. So obviously the Shade can mess with the whole group, but he's always going to be focused on Cyrus. So when he shows up, he's going to be messing with the group in order to try to corrupt Cyrus. He'll be talking to Cyrus personally. He'll be trying to tempt him personally. But it's always about Cyrus, but the rest of the group cares as well about the big, bad, dark creature messing with them and causing them problems as well, because everybody has their own reasons to be here. Nobody wants to die. That works well. Now, we've already talked about Catherine, which we have with Nathan Sky. His wife is the Lich of the island. She's the ruler of the island. She's the reason they're all there. They don't know that when the adventure starts. But of course, she is all about him. She wants to capture him. She wants to torture him. She wants vengeance on him. And that's going to be a very especially relevant character to him. Now, I don't want to reveal, however, that this character too early, because I don't want to reveal the big surprise that his wife is alive and she's the villain of the island till at least the 3rd episode in. I mean, maybe even longer, because that's a great reveal. That's awesome for either his no turning back point, saying, okay, we need to stop this now because my biggest guilt has come to unlife and I need to end her or save her or do something to redeem myself. The moment I reveal that twist, the campaign is going to feel fresh and new for him. And so I want to move that as far as I can without using that big surprise. I want to move along as far as I can without using that surprise because it's going to revitalize everything, make everything feel fresh and exciting again. So, I'm probably not going to reveal that till the 3rd episode or the 4th. So I need to keep him engaged a little bit earlier. Well, we had the idea, of course, and it was in his character dialogue, that his daughter was captured by the Sacred Empire. So, in the meantime, I'll create a character of the Sacred Empire to serve as his personalized villain. The character that he is most interested in, because whoever's commanding the Sacred Empire is the person who stole his daughter from him, or at least whoever's commanding them locally. He will care about that. And for that matter, so will Ishida. Ishida will care about that, because his mother has also been captured by the Sacred Empire for reasons unknown to him and brought to this Dark Isle. So he doesn't know who captured her. It's going to be the Sacred Empire. That is incredibly efficient. That's why he and Nathan would have teamed up in order to get together to rescue their people, their family members. And so they will care about this villain simultaneously. They might wonder, wait, one villain for 2 characters? That's not really good. That's not very special. Well, no, but it does touch on each of their characters' goals specially, and they're both going to segment into separate villains later. Nathan is going to get, of course, his own wife as his ultimate villain, and Ishida is going to get somebody else. Who should that be? Well, going through my notes here, I started saying, if I want Ishida to have a romance plot, I need to make it, which I did, I've talked about that earlier, I need to make it especially relevant to his character. It needs to move his character journey forward. And so his villain should be tied to his romance subplot. The romance subplot shouldn't feel unconnected to the story. It shouldn't be like, okay, we're taking a refuge from the dark campaign to have a romantic dinner among the bone fields. But they glow so prettily at night. No. His romance needs to be tied to the ultimate forces of antagonism of the island. And so how do we do that? Well, this is where I turn to my idea pool. I mentioned last time that I came up with this thing that I really liked called The Legend of the White Snake. And when I say come up with, I mean I researched it, I discovered it. Now, The Legend of the White Snake is a Chinese fable that has to do with an epic romance, and I ended up wanting to use it as the model for Ishida's own romantic subplot. Again, start with a blueprint, start with something that works, capture the best things about it, and then start applying it to your own setting, your own structure, and improving upon it. Work with a good foundation. Put the pieces in place, and then start messing with them. So for this one, The Legend of the White Snake, I ended up seeing a fantastic play in Ashland that was a dramatized version of The Legend of the White Snake. The story works very simply. The White Snake is a demonic spirit who is an actual giant snake, and she's a very powerful magic user, and she falls in love with a mortal. And so she transforms herself into a human woman and marries him, and they are blissfully happy. However, the local high priest discovers that she is a demon spirit, and he wants to exorcise her. Her husband has no idea that she's a demon, and more importantly, she is a lovely person. She's a wonderful character. She is deep, she's caring, she's selfless, she's madly in love with her husband, and she's never hurt anyone. The priest doesn't know this and wouldn't believe it even if it was true. He's convinced that she is a monster that must be destroyed, despite what her husband believes or is willing to accept. So for the rest of the story, he schemes against her and ultimately is able to kidnap her husband, force her into revealing what she is in order to save him, and he imprisons her and destroys the happy couple. It's not a happy story, but it is a well-done tragedy, because the ultimate nobility of the character of the White Snake is proved despite the persecution, and she ultimately shows the evil of the High Priest and the prejudice of him and her own nobility by sacrificing herself to save her husband, and he does live free. So that's really, really powerful. And I wanted to capture some of the essence of that in the ideas of prejudice and black and white thinking in the course of the Ravenshadow campaign. Now you might think, hey, wait, isn't Ravenshadow like legitimately black and white? Don't touch the darkness, don't play with the darkness? Yes. Don't play with dark magic. But that doesn't necessarily mean that if you're not involved with dark magic, but you still look like you're evil, that you actually are evil. So one of the elements I wanted to play with in this fable that I liked so much was the idea of a corrupt high priest. It was a high priest who was corrupt, and even he, who thought he was doing the righteous thing, was actually misguided. That he was actually causing horrible problems and horrible pain, and he was a blight on the community. Now, they considered him a powerful, righteous, noble leader, but that corruption within the church is something that I really, really wanted to play with. And it's something that gave me a lot of inspiration when I was looking at that song Hellfire that I mentioned earlier in building my idea pool. The idea of a powerful, respected, righteous judge, the guy who sees, and this comes from the other song, who sees corruption everywhere except within, which of course is the real place that it comes from. This has a very fun vibe to it. The idea who is the monster and who is the man. And so I like the idea of the White Snake because that comes up with the exact same brilliant lyric that I love so much in the Quasimodo song. Here is a riddle to guess if you can. Who is the monster and who is the man? So that angle is something I really wanted to explore. And I really wanted to tap into that powerful idea. What makes a man a man? What makes a man a monster? And it's not who you're born. It's not your title. It's the actions that you take. It's choosing to reject darkness and it's choosing to embrace light, no matter what your birth or what your creation. That is the most important thing. So that is something I believe deeply, and it's something that I really wanted to bring to life with this romance subplot if I could. And it seemed like a great way to bring it in. Now, the other reason I really like this romantic fable for the purpose of a game is that I believe that in a good romance, you need to make the character fall in love with the person that they are supposed to be romantically interested in. So what makes you fall in love with a character? Well, in the purposes of RPGs, you really aren't dealing with an individual's looks. You don't get to see them. You don't get to talk to them that much. It can be awkward role-playing romantic scenes with your dungeon master. So what's really impressive is the character's actions. You want usually two things in a romance. You want an element of competence that makes you go, wow, and an element of vulnerability that makes you go, oh. Those two things together are usually what create romances. In fact, there's an element in romantic structures called the crack. It's a moment where you see the other character open up in a crack in their emotional armor or their emotional exterior. They show you this vulnerability, and it makes you go, "Aww," and you want to fill that hole in them, to put it bluntly. So this moment is very, very important. Often in stories that involve a romantic element in which a character is wanting to be with another character that do not have this moment, it's not really a romance. You're not really building a story about falling in love. Often those stories are about basically a validation for you, in which the main character wants to be with somebody who is so far out of their league that they have to ultimately get into that character's league. And that character recognizes that, yes, you have built yourself up to be as awesome as I am, to the point where I will now date you or marry you. And so this is often misunderstood as the idea that the character is a mere trophy, and it's not. It's more of a validation. It's almost the equivalent of a job interview, in which, saying oh God, this person would never want to hire me for their company. I'm not good enough to work for them or to work with them. And then you build yourself up, and ultimately your idol says, dude, welcome to the team. I want you to work with me. I want you to be my partner. And it just has to do with a romantic setting. So that's how a lot of those stories work. If you want to do a general romance, you have to actually have an element where the characters are falling in love with each other. The White Snake serves as a great bedrock for this. She is a powerful character, and it focuses on her. If I want to get one of my players engaged with a character, she needs to be someone that feels worth falling in love with. And this powerful, interesting, lonely, noble character is a great one to bring out a character's interest. So, how should I adapt the story to the strengths of my own campaign? Well, first, I'm not using a snake. I want to tap into the big elements of Gothic horror. I like the fact that a snake is threatening and is something that, is a very powerful symbol for something you should be afraid of. But I need to find something that fit Gothic horror better, a world of wolves and ravens. Well, how about a raven? It could work, but ravens are threatening because they're an omen, not because they might kill you. How about a wolf? Perfect. Wolves are classic elements of Gothic horror, they're very threatening, and Carson likes wolves. He really likes wolves. How do I know this? Because he has a companion who is a wolf. He has an actual wolf companion, and that actually serves as a great way to pique her interest. Why is she interested in him? In the fable of the white snake, the snake is the one who initiates the romance with the main character. I believe in various versions she's either told to go see him or that he saves her life in a previous life or in the current life when she's in a normal snake form. There's different versions. The point is that she is captivated by him and she seeks him out, turns herself into a human and initiates the romance. She is active in it. And I need her to be active for two reasons. First, Ishida is a shy kid. He is inexperienced. The romance is part of his coming of age. He needs somebody else to be motivated to start the romance, stay with the group, be willing to make multiple attempts as he fumbles with the romantic interest of the character. So I need her to be pulling things along because I can't count on his character to pull things along. The second reason is that I wanted her to have a very active goal. When the world is filled with other characters with their own goals and their own struggles, that feels very real. And when they are pursuing those goals actively, even without your necessary involvement or you're necessarily driving them to change, the world feels active and alive around you. It's why a lot of open world games like Skyrim got felt more real and more meaningful when you have characters that are going about their daily routine with or without you. You don't want your characters to just stand around, your non-player characters, to feel like they just stand around waiting for a player character to show up. If you keep going back to the same tavern every adventure, that tavern keeper that you've built should have his own life. He should be arguing with his wife, and then they come back next time, and maybe they're divorced, and maybe they come back the third time, and it's revealed that he was actually sleeping with her sister. And they come back the fourth time, and now his son's moved in with him to try to reconcile things. And with this type of movement, it makes the world feel so much more alive. Just do things like this. It's incredibly effective. So we've got our blueprint, and we know she's going to be a wolf that turns herself into a human rather than, obviously, an intelligent wolf. An intelligent wolf that turns herself into a human rather than an intelligent giant snake that turns herself into a human. So, what do we do now? How do we improve on our core foundation? Well, one thing I wanted to really build up was the idea of this character's loneliness. I think that most of the wolves are hated on this island for very good, understandable reason. I wanted something to be equivalent to the idea of why someone might hate this character for being a demon. Well, how do you do that in this Gothic setting? Well, I've mentioned before the idea that the island is under the complete control of the Lord of the Island, that the animals are their eyes and their agents. Well, let's say that because of the character is not actually corrupted by darkness, she's not an agent of the Lord. How could this be possible? If I brought that into a story meeting with the rest of the team on something, usually they would say, but the animals are the property of the Lord. They are all controlled. There are no exceptions. Well, I would say, does it break the core themes of the story if there is an exception for some reason? And the answer is no. Maybe if there's a good reason, there could be an exception, but it wouldn't break the core theme of the story. Nothing says that all wolves have to be under the control of the Lord in order for the core idea of virtue is worth walking through fire to be true. That is not core to the themes. You can afford to make that exception. So all you need then is a good reason that doesn't undermine the rest of the setting. Something that makes sense in the world. And when there's magic involved, this is one reason I love working in fantasy settings, there's always a way to have an exception. You can always have some sort of thing that creates an exception. Now, before I jump in on one of these things, I like to have at least one good reason it could exist. It doesn't have to be the best reason, but it has to be a good reason. That way I know in the future I can come up with a better reason than this one, but in the short term, I have at least this one to fall back on. So, what do I do? I come up with the idea that, hey, the island's lord was hibernating for a very long time. Maybe some of the wolves are not evil, but the villagers still treat them as such. They don't really leave their hallowed ground very often. How would they know? How would they know? So, that was my idea. It's not the ultimate reason that I came up with. I chose a much more interesting and intricate idea for why she's special later. But that was my initial reasoning. That, hey, it's perfectly plausible that some of the island wolves on this particular island are not under the direct control of the Lord because the Lord was hibernating for a very long time and the power is only now being built up again by the Lich, Catherine. So, that's my short-term reason. I've got my idea here. We've got a wolf. She probably does not like most of the dark, corrupted wolves who are monstrous and is not very well treated by them. However, she is fascinated by humans, the same way that a lot of humans might be fascinated by sharks or fascinated by, for that matter, wolves. She can't imagine actually living near one because they're dangerous and they attack wolves on sight and they're monstrous, and she's been told this her whole life, but she is fascinated by them. However, while she's running in the wilds one day, she sees a group of strangers approach from off the shore, which doesn't usually happen. And one of them is walking beside a wolf. And they're talking. And they're eating together. And he's friends with a wolf. That is very, very interesting to her. And she wants to get to know this human. This human who, for some reason, is willing to be with a wolf. So she decides to approach him in a human form because still she's very worried about any sort of anti-wolf prejudice. She doesn't know what's going on here. She doesn't want to risk approaching him in open wolf form. It's much safer to approach a human in a human form, by far. Even if you think that they're willing to get along with wolves, this might be a special case, this might be a trained or chained animal. You don't know what's going on. And maybe he'll just attack you because you're a stranger. I mean, that's definitely something that could happen, and a stranger on a monstrous island. So she enters human form to try to start a conversation. That's the idea. And from there, the idea is that the romance will build, and that she will want to travel with him and get to know him more. She's very interested in this idea of being able to be friends with a human. And that friendship blossoms and grows into something more. This is a really good opening. So, this also creates a very strong villain for the second half of Carson's story, Ishida's story. I keep jumping between the names of Carson the player and Ishida the player character, and I'm sorry for that. But yes, this is a good second half of the story, after the initial Ravenshadow villain has kind of run its course. The second villain, after his mother dies, will be focused on the character that is opposing his romance with this evil wolf character, right? She's not actually evil, she's wonderful, but again, just like the White Snake. So who will this be? The High Priest, the corrupted High Priest. Father Ivan is what I decided to call him. I like the big, strong idea of Ivan. And I really wanted to capture this feeling that he's a powerful, severe character, and Ivan just really captured that essence I felt. So Father Ivan is going to be the local high priest of the island. That he's one of the only people who is willing to walk between the towns. He leads the monastery up in the hallowed ground on the mountain, and he's willing to actually go and visit the various towns and preach to them and help them and so on. But really, he doesn't actually help them with much. He's not willing to heal people, like the lesser people. He constantly mentions that he might have to conserve his powers in order to protect people against a much later threat. He's corrupt. He sort of demands taxes from people to support the monastery. But he considers himself an extremely pure, honorable character who is so much purer than the common, vulgar, weaker man. Which, again, comes directly from the Hunchback of Notre Dame songs that I liked so much, that he believes he is justly proud, that he is legitimately better than them, and that his incredible power is gifted by the Hallow is justification of that. So a good question is, if he's such a jerk, why is he able to wield such amazing holy power? That doesn't make much sense either. I need to come up with a solution for that too. So my initial solution is, again, not the ultimate solution that I go with, but there was at least one option. The option is that the Shade is actually the one who is his god. The Shade is giving him these powers, and that the Shade is just sort of masking the darkness, which is not something he normally does, in order to be a bit more tricky. So Most people don't see Father Ivan actually using magic because he refuses to help people. But when he does, it's fire magic. It's black fire very often. He doesn't really heal people or protect them. He's a devastating, warlock, effectively. Which is another good reason why he doesn't just use healing powers, because he can't really. He's not actually an element of the Hallow in his magic. He's actually a user of dark powers. Now, he believes the Shade is a divine power, and that he's speaking to him and giving him powers for those reasons, because he's a noble, strong, good character. But in reality, no, he is not. Again, this is not the actual solution that I went with, but it's a good enough one. In the future, I can always come up with a better option, and I do, but with this particular one, it is certainly good enough to explain the plot hole. It's good enough to fill in the plot hole, rather. And so if I come up with a better idea, a more interesting idea, in the future, that's fine. But I know that I don't have a plot hole for now, and I can afford to move forward with this storyline. It will not break in the future. I have a firm foundation. So, to recap, we now have a great list of villains to serve as our heroes' special antagonists, with special relevance to their characters' plots. The Ravenshadow commander, the commander of the Sacred Empire's forces on this particular island, the Jester's Isle, is going to be the special villain to two of our main 4 heroes for the first half of the campaign. He is the one who kidnapped their family members and is in control of them while they are hostages. Naturally, he is specially relevant to these characters. It is personal for them to deal with this guy. And I'm going to have to develop him next. At the halfway point, they're going to switch villains. Nathan's villain is going to become his undead wife, who of course is the Lord of the Isle and the major antagonistic force behind the entire campaign. Meanwhile, Carson is going to shift into his romance plot as the main focus. When his mother dies, the person he came to save, his romance is going to take over that tragic moment, and that's going to be a great area for his romantic interest, our wolf girl, to step up her game and to be there for him in his darkest moment and build a real emotional connection in the story. And that's the moment where she might really start falling in love with him and not just being curious as to his nature. And at that point, he's going to shift into the major antagonist to that, which is Father Ivan, the corrupt high priest, who suspects the true identity of his girlfriend as a wolf spirit and wants to destroy her for it, and wants to therefore destroy their relationship, and believes that she is corrupting him. He wants to save him for his own purposes, when in reality, he of course is becoming a major thorn in this character's side. Now, we'll introduce Father Ivan in the early elements of the campaign. Likely they'll run into him in the first few episodes, and we might even reinforce him a few times, so that later, when he turns against them, they start to realize, holy crap, now we're fighting this guy who used to be a unsettling, powerful character who kind of just creeped us out a little bit, but in reality, now he's a villain, and now he's causing us problems. So I can build up Father Ivan as a enigmatic potential ally in the first few episodes and emphasize his power and let them have conversations with him directly, face to face, before either party wants to kill the other. And then, only later on, after it's time for him to play the major villainous role, then he can become a villain that they need to stay away from at all costs. And that serves a very strong story structure. Ian's guard's character, Baloran, on the other hand, also has unflipped antagonists. Only Chad really has one major antagonist that he sticks with through the entire campaign. Now, Ian's guard's character is going to be going through a disillusionment plot. So, halfway through, he sort of realizes, holy crap, my life is a lie, the guys I'm working for are bad, and I need to switch away from the Sacred Empire to work with the heroes instead against them. So for the first half of the campaign, his special antagonist will be, the Jester. Yes, the Jester Nikolai. The person that they think is in charge of the island when it's actually Catherine who overthrew him and stole his scepter. Isn't he dead? Isn't he destroyed? Well, he doesn't have to be. Undead things can be very hard to kill. So, I decide that when she stole his scepter, he actually wasn't murdered, she just destroyed his physical body, and he escaped into something else, and uses it as a host for his spirit until he gets his scepter back. So we also have this other interesting character with his own goals right now. We have a character who wants to get his scepter back, who wants to reclaim his power over the island, and maybe can try to manipulate some of the powerful individuals on the island to do this for him. So, he will serve as an antagonist to Baloran. Why? Because, hey, the guy is an agent of the Sacred Empire, potentially. Maybe just rubs him the wrong way. Whatever. I will come up with some reason why he particularly wants to mess with Baloran. That will be fun. That will be very fun. And just quick side note, I'm looking at a bunch of geese, which, geese are evil, but they're surrounded by little geese babies. Oh, it's so sweet right now. All right, anyway, back to the RPG, back to the story discussion. So, even while I'm surrounded by cuteness, let's talk about darkness. The Jester will be in, I believe, a mannequin or a puppet. Ooh, a puppet, that's good. A marionette, something like that. So puppets and marionettes are really creepy. And when the players go to the Jester's Carnival, which is something that I want them to do early so they can get a clear idea of this big set piece for who the Jester was. And it has to happen early because before they realize the Jester isn't actually the guy they're dealing with, they're actually dealing with Nathan's wife. So probably in episode 1 or 2, they will go to this Jester's Carnival. And once they're there, they will meet this weird undead or possessed mannequin or puppet that will both help them and hurt them all at once. They have to sort of interact with to get him to do things, but at the same time, he starts really antagonizing Baloran in some way. I don't know what it is yet, but I'm guessing I can arrange for Baloran to antagonize him in some way or get one over on him in some way in the early scenes so that the characters have a reason to have a grudge against each other. And for in the future, this character could show up to mess specifically with Baloran. And Baloran will want to mess back because Ian wants to figure out how to win. And seeing Ian, who is a great straight man, like he has a great oh my god face and reacts very, very well to bizarre situations, he will be a great comic foil to a weird, zany, creepy character that follows the ideas of how a mad, insane jester possessing a puppet would actually act. So that will be his character for the start of the adventure. And then again, things will shift because once he betrays the Sacred Empire, the commander of the Sacred Empire, who was serving as the villain for Nathan and Ishida's first half of their campaign arc, he will now serve as the villain for the second half of our disillusioning, betraying character's growth arc. So, that is a very efficient use of our character. He serves as special villains to different people at different times. And altogether, we have our villains, we have our special relevance, and we just need to weave them together. So, I ultimately decide on the following plot structure. I decide to pair up our characters so that we can get some more economy. I considered having every character get their own episode in which the 90% of their story happened, so you get the entire focus for one episode, but we're going to be playing for 5 to 6 hours. We don't really need to do that. And I also don't want you to run out your entire story in one episode, or most of it, because that's going to be an amazing episode, but then you're going to kind of just be in stasis for most of the rest of the campaign. And I want you to always be coming to the campaign wondering what's going to happen next in your story and rewarded by something actually happening in your story. So I decide instead to split things up like this. In sessions 1, 3, and 5, I would have 2 of the characters get most of the focus, and the other 2 characters get at least one scene. So imagine, for example, the session lasts about 5 hours. I would dedicate 2 hours of the session focused specifically on characters A and B. And then characters C and D would get about half an hour each dedicated to them. Now, half an hour is a significant amount of gaming time. It's a small portion of 5 hours of a gaming session, but it is enough to get some major character movement, some interesting discussion. It's enough to have a meaningful thing happen and a meaningful conversation happen for your character that makes you feel different by the end of the adventure, that something has moved you forward. On the other hand, I get 2 hours of focus on my other 2 characters, which is like a movie length of time. And since we're going to be doing almost entirely dialogue and discussion in this game, not much combat, there's going to be a lot of material to move my characters forward in huge, huge portions over the course of those 2 hours. Now, on episodes 2, 4, and 6, so alternating, I would flip it. Characters C and D would get the 2 hours each focus, and characters A and B would just get one scene or so, about half an hour each, to move their stories forward. So this way, you show up to a session, and you always leave the session feeling that something happened, something mattered, something moved your story forward. On the other hand, half the time when you show up, you will get a huge amount of story focus. And this is much better than trying to juggle between all 4 stories in any given episode. Because if you don't feel like you're focused on in any episode, it feels very chaotic. You don't have as much emphasis to put on what actually mattered to you in that session. And you don't get the big peaks and valleys of stuff really happening that matters to you a lot versus stuff just being focused on one important scene. So I wanted to have as much focus as possible, because focus makes stories better. But at the same time, I wanted to make sure everybody was always involved. And I also didn't want any stories to end before the climax of this campaign. So you might wonder, well, 1, 3, and 5, isn't that going to cause some real problems? Because 2 of the players don't really feel that invested until episode 2, and 2 of the players have their stories end before the final campaign, or rather the final episode of the campaign? Well, I was worried about that. So what do? I decided that I would focus on Ian's character, Ishida, and Gabe's character, Nathan, in the first 2 episodes. But have the other 2 characters play pivotal roles. Now, the reason I did it this way is because it was the most efficient use of my resources. Ian's character is mostly enjoying an undercover role, and Ian likes solving problems. He doesn't need the story to focus on him, so it didn't make sense to make his character really shine in story moments in terms of episode 1. He would be interested as playing the spy for the Sacred Empire in the course of those episodes and figuring out where he stands with the other players and solving the major tactical problems. He didn't need the story focus. On the other hand, we've got 2 characters who both have the very similar goal. They both have their relatives who have been kidnapped by the Sacred Empire. They both want to rescue them. Naturally, it's very easy to put their stories together in a paired episode structure. And they start with a problem before the campaign does. Neither Nathan nor Baloran's character actually start with those problems. Also, Chad would get to make a big entrance on his own. Cyrus Mori, his character, Chad likes grandstanding. He likes being special. And so being able to present him as a special character who is in the service of his lord that can help them in some way or wants to use them in some way, he would do very well in his opening episode to have 1 or 2 really important moments of badassery or importance in general. So it just worked very well to pick these 2 characters for the first episode. And it would be very easy to keep the other 2 characters engaged within that first episode. Now, what about the last episode? If your character's journey ends in episode 5, then why are you interested in the last episode? That's going to feel lame. It'll feel like an epilogue. Well, I decided the characters' journeys would not ultimately end. Remember, you still get a good half hour of that final episode. So for the other 2 characters, it would serve as the ultimate climax and resolution. The climax often happens at the 95% point of the story, and the resolution is what follows after. So for our main 2 characters, well, they're not main, but the characters that start in episodes 1, 3, and 5, Gabe's character, Nathan, and Carson's character, Ishida, they would have their resolutions and their climaxes happen in those episodes. Since Carson kind of loses everyone, his ultimate growth into a hero will be standing on his own and proving that he doesn't need anybody else to stand for him anymore. He gets to be a hero, get revenge for his fallen loved ones, and ultimately destroy the evil that is corrupting his friend, his wolf friend, who we decided earlier on is going to get corrupted partway through, and the only way to free him is by destroying the shadows. And he doesn't need his mother to fight for him. He doesn't need anybody to stand beside him. He will stand with his friends, but he's standing on his own 2 feet. He's not leaning on anyone. And so for him, that is a moment that will prove his character growth. Now for Nathan Sky, Gabe's character, his journey is all about self-forgiveness. And you would think, okay, if your final episode is going to be, say, a fight with Nathan's wife, shouldn't that be a major plot moment for him? Well, not really. It doesn't have to be, because his journey is all about his own forgiveness and resurrection, his redemption. It's a redemption plot. He has to go on a character journey that allows him to forgive himself for what he did and be willing to make things right, to overcome his cowardice and ultimately choose to sacrifice himself to save his family instead of letting her die because he was too cowardly to stop and save her. So that character journey can happen majorly, the major impetus that causes him to forgive himself, grow, redeem himself, and change in episode 5. And then episode 6, the final episode, is when he just follows through on it. And that will be his half hour of that episode. Remember, you still get a portion of the final episode. You're just not the main focus of it. So, for the ultimate climax, we have 2 characters that work very well. We've got the Shade, who cares greatly about Cyrus. He wants to corrupt him, so in the final episode he'll be trying really hard to corrupt him, and when they kill, which I'm planning on them doing, the current lord of the island, or get rid of her in some way, or get the scepter back from her in some way, something to depose her, at this point, the Shade will want a replacement, and he's been wanting to corrupt Chad the whole time. So if he gets a chance to corrupt Chad's character, Cyrus, this is a great time for him to make the big final push to get him to take the scepter, take on the mantle of the Lord, and do some stuff for all the right reasons that will ultimately put him on the path of Nikolai. Great moment for Chad, to be handed his ultimate opportunity with the darkness and to reject it, hopefully. Now, on the other hand, what about Ian? What about his character, Baloran? Why are they in the big final episode? Well, remember, they have a disillusionment plot, and our structure for the disillusionment plot involves the ultimate climax being that the character defies and defeats the order they used to champion. And how are they trying to do that? Well, the Sacred Empire wants the Shadow Scepter. This is the big climax. It's going to involve the Shadow Scepter, certainly. It's going to give Ian a chance to get it and then not give it to them, to defy them. And so for him, his major moments and his discussions with that can happen in the final episode. And also, again, Ian is not majorly character focused. What his major goal is he wants to be handed ultimate tactical problems and to solve them. And the big episode serving as the ultimate clash that things have been building up to the entire campaign with the forces of darkness, giving him a chance to win that battle is going to thrill and engage him like nothing before. Okay. So we've got our core structure, we've got our character journeys, we've got our personalized villains, which will allow everybody to shine when it's their turn in the spotlight. We have got a huge amount of material to start with, and at this point it's time to start fleshing out the actual meat of every individual adventure. So tune in next time when we continue our discussion of Ravenshadow and go into the step-by-step creation of each of our 6 adventures and the characters that bring them to life. If you've made it this far into the podcast, please drop us a 5-star review on iTunes. It really shows that you appreciate the podcast, and it's really great to see that people do that, and it helps the thing spread. It really means a lot to me. Because, hey, if you got a full hour of this, surely that's worth some sort of review, right? Okay. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye.